My name is Maria DiCenzo, and I teach in the Department of English and Film Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Canada. My research is focused on the feminist press in the interwar period in Britain, and so my goal in this brief talk is to situate Time and Tide in the context of the women's movement and feminist print culture in the years following the First World War. What occasions this centenary celebration is the fact that Time and Tide was one of the most significant publications to emerge in the interwar period. As a general audience weekly review, it covered politics and culture nationally and internationally. At the same time, as a review run by women, among them prominent feminist writers, journalists, and editors, Time and Tide provided a forum for and participated in the major feminist debates of the period. In this, it was not alone. So by highlighting the legacy of this particular journal, the centenary creates an opportunity to acknowledge the variety of feminist groups and publications that were part of these public conversations and periodical communities. To understand its position and role, we need to consider what 1920 represents in the history of the women's movement more generally. I use the term women's movement in the widest sense here to include not only overtly feminist groups and initiatives, but also the numerous voluntary, non-political, party, or faith-based organizations which engaged in forms of advocacy by and for women. The few years before 1920 saw the end of the war, the passing of the first franchise bill, which gave women over 30 who met the property requirement voting rights in parliamentary elections, and some significant legislative victories, such as the Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919. Contrary to the historical narratives of demise and defeat, namely that the war forced an end to feminist campaigning and it was back to home and duty after women's outstanding war effort, what we see instead in these years is new momentum, especially on the part of suffrage and other women's reform groups who had worked tirelessly for decades. This was not the end of a struggle, but rather a new beginning. The metaphors used to describe the impact of the partial franchise varied: a key to unlock the door, our new power, the second round, and Lady Rhonda's idea of the halfway house. But they were all attempts to capture and underscore the work and gains that lay ahead. The war may have generated new problems and complicated old ones, but it did not deactivate feminism. At the national level, demobilization, intensified competition between women and men in the workforce, women fought to keep and advance their jobs in industry and in professions like the civil service. At the same time, post-war political diplomacy fueled the involvement of feminist pacifists in international campaigns to debate and intervene in world conflicts and to promote peace. For example, the efforts of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Other groups, including the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, worked to harness the franchise gains made in some countries to promote change for women around the world. These causes drew support from existing and new constituencies of participants, many of them former suffragists, in a landscape of radically changing social and economic conditions and political opportunities. Feminist periodicals were ambitious in their attempts to serve as a meeting ground for different tendencies in the movement. Print media served as the chief vehicles for these debates between divergent and sometimes conflicting figures and organizations. Time and Tide, and associated with it the 6-Point Group, were the newcomers on the scene in the early 1920s, even if their personnel had a longer history of involvement in feminism and journalism. As a new paper, Time and Tide claimed it would fill the gap no other present organ had managed to do. And the 6-Point Group, an important organization still surprisingly understudied, announced officially in February 1921 it would end a phase of stagnation and promised to use its newly won power with energy and vigor to achieve a set of overdue reforms, claiming, "Everyone has grown tired of talking. We all want to get something done." Reminiscent of the bold entrance of the Women's Social and Political Union into the suffrage campaign, advocating deeds, not words, many years before. But it's important to remember who was already on the scene and supposedly wasting time with talk. These other societies included major organizations which began life as pre-war suffrage societies and continued their work sometimes under new names into the 1920s and 30s. All of them published their own official organs. Of these, the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship, NUSEC, was the longest running, formerly the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies from 1897 to 1919. The former Common Cause, founded in 1909, became the Women's Leader in 1920. The Women's Freedom League, another established organization, began publishing The Vote in 1909, continuing until the death of its benefactor, Dr. Elizabeth Knight, in 1933, when it was replaced by the Women's Freedom League Bulletin. Denominational suffrage societies continued their work and published journals under new titles in the interwar years. The Catholic Suffragist became the Catholic Citizen. The Church League for Women's Suffrage became the Church Militant. Youth Suffragi became the International Women's Suffrage News. A host of labor and occupationally based organizations also debated feminist issues as part of their more specialized mandates. Engineers, women civil servants, teachers, journalists. They represented different ideological positions and genres, but collectively, these kinds of publications reflected the growing diversification of feminist discourses and the women's movement more generally. In addition to serving the functions of movement-based media, in the process, they also covered everything from social, economic, and political developments nationally and internationally to literature and the arts, mediating the world from feminist perspectives. I want to use the very brief space remaining to point to the role of periodicals in understanding these different tendencies and to address the theme of consensus and conflict in my title and signaled by the Feminism Divided article by Winifred Holtby in the souvenir edition of Time and Tide. The shift from gaining voting rights to actually using the vote to leverage change would prove difficult and contentious. It was one thing to pursue the singular goal of votes for women, and that was far from straightforward, and quite another to address the plethora of issues affecting women in the domestic sphere, in the institutions of public life, and in international politics. These issues included equal franchise, guardianship rights, nationality of married women, maternal health, birth control, endowment of motherhood, equal pay, abolition of the marriage bar, education and university degrees, moral double standards, sex trafficking, promoting peace, fighting fascism, and ensuring a role for women in the League of Nations, just to mention a few. Equality would prove to be a complex and divisive concept. The labels of new feminism and old feminism Holtby uses in 1926 might be confusing to readers new to the sources and terminology. In the very broadest terms, these were used to distinguish between equalitarians, quote unquote, old feminists who were focused on securing equality of rights and opportunities under the law and in the labor market, while new or welfare feminists, represented by Eleanor Rathbone and other leading figures in NUSEC, were interested in a broader social reform agenda, which eventually included the controversial measures of family allowances and birth control. Disputes erupted in the 1920s within, not just among, organizations over these competing agendas and strategies for effecting change. Equalitarians labeled Rathbone and her supporters social reformers to imply they were not feminists at all. And they, in turn, accused old feminists of an unimaginative doctrinaire sort of feminism, of pursuing a narrow equality agenda at the expense of a wider front. It's important to remember that much of what we know about these debates comes from the pages of periodicals, notably Time and Tide and Woman's Leader. What these lively exchanges in the articles and correspondence pages of the papers capture are the diverse ways in which feminism, equality, and social change were framed and articulated by key groups and figures at the time. By embracing controversy, as some were willing to do, they gave readers opportunities to confront the challenges and even to formulate their own positions instead of taking sides. As Edith Howe Martin stated in her letter to Time and Tide in March 1927, she agreed with both the equalitarian position and with new sex reforms, which she, as a birth control advocate, saw as benefiting married women, concluding, "We want both equality and new feminism and can work for both simultaneously." I would like to conclude by stressing why these differences were important, why contention was constructive. As Claire Eustace and I have argued, conflict can be instructive, and feminism has developed as much out of disagreements among advocates as it has out of disagreements with opponents. To dismiss tensions within the movement as evidence of weakness or to characterize debate negatively as fragmentation is to ignore the difficulty of mobilizing consensus around controversial measures, ranging from birth control and the rights of mothers to equal opportunities and rights to education and work, all while continuing to campaign for equal franchise rights until 1928. If the achievements of interwar feminism seem modest, it should be remembered that they were the product of persistent struggle in the face of hostile conditions. The demands women were making challenged social norms, and they impinged on the interests of male-dominated government, capital, labor, and religious groups. The periodicals I have only been able to point to here represent a valuable, even if partial, record of those debates, and I encourage new readers to explore them as a point of entry into the rich history of interwar feminisms. Thank you very much.